My name is Kasperowski. I'm from the Department of Theory of Science, or should I say Philosophy, Linguistics and Theory of Science, because Theory of Science is part of a larger department nowadays. And I've been asked to give a short talk about new possibilities for collaboration on citizen science, the possibilities of collaboration in citizen science then. And I've decided to say something about the different forms of citizen science that are alive at the moment and their possibilities for contributing to the sustainable development goals. When it comes to the image of citizen science and the new forms for collaboration, I put them in block science here. And it is actually not a new form for collaborating in science. It's actually quite an old one, but it also goes under the name open science. And it is depicted, citizen science, as a move from the end products of science, which we usually disseminate to the surrounding society and to the public, to upstreams participation and co-creation of scientific knowledge together with outsiders, so to speak, that is interested parties, stakeholders, or citizens. And that has become possible through the immense digitalization that we have been witnessing during the last, shall we say, 20 years or so. And aspects of citizen science today is already taken in my field as a kind of image of a coming reconfiguration of general citizenship, which means that the citizenship will become more data-driven now than it has been before. Usually citizenship is considered as being part of democratic society and stuff like that, but it's not only about the representation of you by your politicians, it's also the possibilities for citizens to be represented by data and knowledge, which is then a change of citizenship. That means that you don't need to have a signed list of 200 people or 1,000 people saying that we don't want this traffic route in our vicinity. Instead, you can collect data and present data that this will severely affect the environment, for instance. And that would then be a new form of data-driven citizenship. Citizen science then is actually an old practice with a new name, or is it really an old practice with a new name? If we go back in history a bit, we can see already in the Swedish context that probably earlier than 1870s also, we had, for instance, Linnaeus that can be considered to distribute the tasks of research amongst his disciples and people outside science also. So it's very much about the distribution of tasks in the scientific process. And the Swedish meteorology and phonology already in the 1870s had an extensive networks of contributors contributing observations and data to scientists. Astronomy has a very, very long legacy of distributing their tasks beyond professional scientists. The standard tale of the history of citizen science usually takes its starts with the Audubon Christmas bird count on the east coast of the United States that started in the early 1900s. During the same period then, with the start of the 1900s, we had an increasing professionalization of science and research around the world. And that has been taken as a, shall we say, a proof or that citizens or outsiders didn't have access to the processes of science anymore in such an extensive rate they had before. But that is actually from the data we have on historical publications that it is not true. Instead, outsiders that collected data for scientists were made invisible in final publications because of a worry with the quality of data and the way that peers or peer reviewers would look upon that type of data. And that still occurs, actually. I've just peer reviewed a couple of articles where that still occurs, that you make the contributors, the volunteer contributors, invisible, which now is considered as one of the more problematic ethical legacies of citizen science. So earlier, if volunteer contributors were made invisible because of the risk of peers' comments on the quality of data, there currently are actually no limits in terms of visibility for the outsiders. And as we heard before here, there's a lot of expectations and imaginaries on citizen science from policy and from both inside and outside science today, which I sometimes wonder if citizen science actually can live up to. But we can discuss that later on. So citizens and collaboration then. There are, as I said at the outset of this presentation, there are different forms of citizen science, which I think are important to have a little bit of a grasp on. And the first one is what is usually thought about when we talk about citizen science. It is projects that are initiated from institutionalized or professionalized science and research, and where volunteers or contributors or citizens or whatever we would like to call them are invited in some aspect of the research process. Usually it has to do with the observations and collection of data. Another form, which can be called public engagement with science and policy, is an open discussion, the opening up of discussions between stakeholders when scientific data or scientific results are underpinning political decision making. And sometimes that knowledge can be, as scientific knowledge often are, a bit uncertain. And then you have to engage and involve the concerned stakeholders with discussions on the course of decisions. And lastly, we have something that can be called civic mobilization with data, and that is when concerned groups, usually concerned about health or environmental aspects, are taking initiative themselves on measuring or monitoring some aspects of their environment or their health. Usually, or a very common is air quality in inner cities. I will go into these one by one now. So let's start with the first one, initiatives from institutionalized science and research. Usually we did a meta review of this research some years ago. And it's usually environment, health, biodiversity, conservation, and that type of research that goes into this. We have a very shall we say, internationally well-known project in Sweden, which is called Artportalen, or the Swedish Species Observation System, which is, and that is actually an interesting aspect of citizen science, that most people in Sweden do not know that there is a subset of the Swedish population that are actually producing a lot of data, which is then collected in Artportalen, or the Swedish Species Observation System, and it is extensively used by Swedish authorities. The Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, Naturvårdsverket, Swedish Forest Agency, our regional boards or Länsstyrelser, even the environmental courts use this data for legal and political decision making, which is, I think, an interesting aspect of modern society. A subset of the citizenry produce a lot of the data that then will affect the larger part of society. So it's actually already used, citizen data, in societal decision-making concerning sustainability in several countries, and Sweden is one of the more developed when it comes to this, but not the only one, of course. The second form, as I introduced them before, is about citizen science as public engagement with science policy. And this is about involving relevant stakeholders in contested science policy matters. And in Sweden, you can think about, for instance, nuclear waste, where we should store our nuclear waste, fishing quotas, large issues affecting society and our planet. And this is about bridging the gap between scientific expert knowledge and lay knowledge or lay experiences to increase legitimacy and trust in decision making. This is not about citizens collecting data. This is about citizens, or there is actually a very good Swedish term for this already, and it's used by local communities in Sweden, and it's called medborgardialog. Medborgardialog. I don't know if there's non-Swedish speakers here, but it is about involving concerned stakeholders. For instance, if you want to locate burnt out nuclear waste somewhere in Sweden, you have to include the local stakeholders in the decision making on this. And usually that includes the questioning of the scientific knowledge that this political decision making then, or democratic decision making, will be resting upon. And then the last one, which I think is a very interesting one, and it is citizen science as civic mobilization with data. And it is actually the way that citizenship is changing today. I think this is a good illustration of this. It is, we have political representation. We have our political parties that represent us in the parliament. But this is about citizen groups seeking epistemic representation, that is, knowledge that represent them as concerned citizens, and seeking maybe environmental justice and local sustainability. And this can sometimes be done in opposition to professional science, but not always, could also be in conjunction with professional science. It's initiated by citizens, triggered by a matter of concern for their community. And it's, as I said, seeking epistemic representation, usually about environment, health, and sustainability. And it's usually thought of as some kind of civic empowerment in relation to corporate or government interests, and with the search for social change. And this, I hope you can see my cursor when I move it around now. This is a very famous example of this type of citizen science. It's a bucket that is used to take air samples, and it's from a community in Louisiana, which they call themselves the Louisiana Bucket Brigades, and it's about collecting data on air quality because there's a lot of refineries around here. This part of Louisiana is actually called the death corridor of Louisiana because there's so much pollution from oil refineries. And these people are collecting air samples, sending them to a laboratory outstate of Louisiana, and use this data to for legal matters, for relocation money and stuff like that. And the stakeholders, it is with very high stakes here, it's because people are dying of cancer and stuff like that. All right. So citizen science then, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. When we talk about the possibility of citizen science to measure and monitor the SDGs, it's usually the first form of citizen science that I was talking about here, maybe the second one also. And the arguments for using citizen science then is one of funding, because there is a belief that if we could have long-term citizen science projects like the Swedish Art Portalen or the Swedish Species Observation Portal, we could transcend the shortages of funding and the short-term funding, because we need long-term funding if we are going to be able to monitor the SDGs. We can also get a finer spatial and temporal scales with citizen science. It is maintained. The frequency of collecting data will be higher in CS than if we use, shall we say, traditional or ordinary data. And it can be aligned with SDG indicators. It is already done so when it comes to the red listing of birds, for instance. But there are also problems using CS, which is then citizen science. The quality of data seems to be popping up its head all the time. It is also a question of the motivations of citizens. And more lately, there has been a rather large discussion on the ethics of citizen science, which can lead to exploitations of citizens, some would argue. And there are probably others we don't know really of yet. So what is then the evidence of citizen science contribution to the SDGs? Yeah, there is actually a quite recent systematic review that is open access by Freisel et al., which is called Mapping Citizen Science Contributions to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I will actually take this opportunity to go through this paper a bit with you. This is the methodology for the systematic review. It's about compiling all the SDG indicators, the 244 of them, but reviewing the metadata and the work plan, of course, and search for citizen science projects around the world, and to see if they are aligned with the SDG indicators, to determine if citizen science is already contributing, could contribute, or if there's no alignment at all. And then there is the first peer review by the co-authors about this. And then there's the second peer review by the lead author and the UN Environment custodian agencies. It could be the World Bank, the UNODC, and the WHO, etc. Because every SDG indicator have a custodian. And then there's a final mapping then of the possibilities of citizen science to contribute to the monitoring of the SDG indicators then. And the results of this is that citizen science is already contributing, but not as much as we think maybe, but already contributing means that data from at least one citizen science projects are already used for reporting on a specific SDG indicator at the national or global level. The other one, could contribute, is where data from at least one CS project could be used for a specific SDG indicator, but not used so far. And it will probably need some modification before it can be done so. And the third one is there's no alignment present at all. So the results then is that all SDGs actually have at least one indicator to which citizen science could potentially contribute. That is the evaluation of the authors. And citizen science is already well contributing to the monitoring of 5 SDGs, which is actually very few then, but I will go through them with you later. It could contribute by providing direct and supplementary information to 76 of them. And for the remaining 165, there were no ongoing or past citizen science initiatives that could be identified. So then they have also made this result in the percentages of that citizen data are already contributing or could contribute to the monitoring of around 33 of the SDG indicators then. So, so citizen science is already contributing to the monitoring of 5 SDG indicators, and one of these is the number 9, industry, infrastructure and innovation, and they are several citizen science projects contributing to the Rural Access Index, and the custodian of this then is the World Bank. I don't know if you're familiar with Rural Access Index. I'm not so much, but it is about the possibilities of transport in a land and how that could be enhancing the industry and infrastructure and innovation of that particular part of the world. But citizen science is also contributing quite extensively to number 14, life below water. And there are 4 types of sub-indicators for coastal eutrophication and another 4 for marine littering, focusing on plastics here. And probably there are a lot of projects locally in different countries that the evaluators and authors of this paper don't know of. They just mentioned two large pilot studies now that are done in Kenya and in Mauritius, which is about marine plastic on beaches and shorelines. And these pilots then will be extended to 7 additional countries in Asia and Africa into 2020 then. So life below water is actually one of the more where citizen science actually have an impact already. But also, of course, in life on land, where citizen science is currently informing SDG indicators when it comes to important bird and biodiversity area. You could image Artportalen or the Swedish Species Observation System as one of these then, producing the red list index then. And when we discuss citizen science and the possibilities of citizen science to contribute to the SDGs, which is then recognized by the UN also. This is a quote by Gillian Campbell, who is the responsible statistician for the UN Environment Program. She says, in fact, we have sufficient data for tracking global process for 68% of the environment-related sustainable development goals. We will never be able to monitor the environmental dimension of the goals using traditional data sources alone. So there is high expectations on citizen science, or could be other forms of non-traditional data acquiring also. But the question is then, how can connections between global challenges and local citizen participation, that is these large-scale system and place-based systems, be attained? How or if can standards be established for citizen-generated data suitable for SDG monitoring agencies? And I think the two very important questions are these. How can different forms of citizen science be aligned with SDGs? Or is it just the first form that is suitable for this? And the very important but seldom asked question, how to motivate participation without exploitation of concerned communities then, which is then the ethics of citizen science. I think that was all from me. So thanks for listening.